Today we're going to dive into lines in the sand, what they are, and how you draw a line in the sand in your particular debate. So a line in the sand is a distinction you make between what you're willing to support and what you are not willing to support in that debate. And the reason for that difference is where you draw that particular line. And most debates are going to require you to draw some kind of line. For example, in the debate about cyber warfare being a legitimate form of protest, you have to draw a line in the sand about what is a just form of protest and if cyber warfare fits that. So where you draw that line in terms of what protest fits that criteria would be your line in the sand. Another debate, for example, could be about governments being allowed to censor the media during times of war. And the line in the sand you might want to draw there is when you think it's okay for government to intervene or regulate the media. And those instances that you choose to support or the ones you choose to not defend is where you're drawing a line in the sand in that particular instance. The very important thing about lines in the sand is that you have to think about them before the debate happens. Most of you get to a debate room and the other team is like, would you support this? And you're like, maybe, maybe not. And most of those decisions end up being inconsistent with your team lines. When you're drawing a line in the sand, you have to be thinking about this consciously in your preparation time. It has to be delivered to the adjudicator from the outset of your speech, and it must remain consistent throughout your different speakers so you aren't called out for being principally inconsistent. So there are two approaches to drawing a line in the sand in a debate. Both approaches, you first have to ask yourself, what is the principled question I'm trying to answer in this debate or in this argument? In the first approach, you're going to then come up with an argument outside of the examples to answer that principled question. After you have the argument, you're going to look at the examples that could play out in that debate and choose which ones you think fit that argument and which ones don't fit that argument. The second approach is to first look at the examples and decide which ones you're willing to support and which ones you are not willing to support. Now, the examples you're willing to support, you can then analyze them and see, is there a thread that ties them all together, and can we derive an argument from that thread? So I'm going to show you an example of both approaches right now. So, moving on to the first approach. Now, once again, the first approach is about asking the principled question, coming up with the arguments, and then fitting the examples to the arguments. The notion we're going to do is this house will allow consensual cannibalism. And the principled question you might be trying to answer in that debate is, to what extent do we allow consented self-harm in society, and when should the government be allowed to intervene in individual freedom? So if you were the opposition in that debate, your answer argumentatively to that question might consist of two arguments. The first argument is that we allow governments to intervene when there's a limited value of that action and a disproportionate harm that is created, or when legislation doesn't change the nature of that harm. So even if it's legal or illegal, the harms don't get better or worse on either side. Once you have that argument, you're now going to look at examples that could play out in that debate and if you would be willing to support or not support those particular arguments. So let's firstly look at tattoos. So would you, as an opposition side in the consensual cannibalism debate, be willing to defend tattoos? And the point is you probably would, because tattoos don't create such a disproportionate harm to the individuals. Even though it might not be of maximum value to people, there's not a disproportionate harm that would justify our banning of tattoos. Another example you might be willing to support is alcohol and smoking, because alcohol and smoking fit the second part of our criteria about legislation changing the nature of those harms. So if we decide right now at this point to make alcohol and smoking illegal, and forcing those entities into the black market might be far worse for us, and therefore we are willing to keep alcohol and smoking legal because legalization does change the nature of those harms. However, with consensual cannibalism, if you want to give your finger to somebody to eat it, your finger's gone. So therefore, it doesn't change, whether it's legal or illegal, it doesn't change the nature or the severity of that harm. On the other side, you might not be willing to defend things like self-flagellation or self-mutilation, because self-mutilation is quite a permanent and disproportionate harm that is created to the individual. So for example, if in that debate the proposition side gets up and asks your POI, would you force feed the anorexic? Now you have to think to yourself, you have to be principally consistent as the opposition. So, if your principle says governments are allowed to intervene to protect against disproportionate harms, you would most probably be willing to force feed the anorexic because you don't value individual choice up to a point where it creates disproportionate harm to the individual. Cool, so that was approach one. We come up with the argument and then fit examples to the particular argument. Moving on to the second approach, where we're going to first look at examples that fit the principled question and then see what thread ties them together and derive an argument from that. The motion we're going to do is this House would ban private healthcare in favor of a comprehensive public healthcare system in South Africa. So, here you have to think about examples in status quo that would generally play out in this motion. And the principal question you're trying to answer in that debate is, when should an entity or a commodity be completely government-owned or completely public? So in status quo, entities that are usually government-owned are like water and electricity, and ones that are usually like privatized are food, shelter, and education, that have a bit of both or are completely privatized. So in terms of water and electricity and healthcare, we're trying to find a thread that ties all three of these entities together so we can derive an argument from them. So these entities are all necessary commodities, firstly. Second of all, they're all very similar in product. So distinguishing between water in one area and water in another area is very hard to do, and therefore, because of how similar these products are, our normal competition mechanisms that would drive down costs might not be as relevant when it comes to very similar products like water, electricity, and healthcare. Thirdly, most of these products are very fixed and consistent prices. So for example, the input costs that go into a hospital, go into an operation, are quite similar. Like the input cost of starting up a dam or starting up an electricity grid are also very similar. Fourthly, most of these entities have large and excessive upfront costs. So the ability to create an entire hospital affects the amount of people who are able to engage in that market, and moreover, the ability to construct a dam might affect the amount of people who are able to compete in the water markets. So once again, your competition analysis doesn't work to the same extent with these commodities and doesn't really act to push down prices as we would want it to. And lastly, all of these entities to some extent have a location-based monopoly, meaning that living in one area means you're most likely to use the supplier of that particular area. So for example, if I live in Nelspruit, I'm very unlikely to use a hospital in Pretoria. Of course, this is argumentative, so the other side is going to argue that healthcare does not fit these criteria. On the other end of the spectrum are other examples of food and shelter. Even though they are necessary, they are very different products that differ in the way they can be packaged and given to consumers. So competition is quite large when it comes to these commodities. There are very different prices and very different input prices that are involved in them. There isn't such a significant upfront cost to starting up like a shop or to selling food, for example. And lastly, there's not really a location-based monopoly in those areas. So that's why we would be willing to make water, electricity, and healthcare all public if we were the proposition team, and not make food and shelter. And that's where we choose to draw the line in the sand. So that's example of approach 2, where you come up with the examples and then derive an argument from the example. Once again, it's very important to remain consistent in your principle, especially when your RCPO either challenges you, and to say that principle from the get-go. I hope that was helpful, and stay tuned for more videos. Bye-bye.